How's everybody doing this morning? There were a couple of scriptures just to start out with I wanted to share. One's in Ecclesiastes, if you want to jump over there. In chapter 11. There's been a theme running through my experience with the Lord for a long time. And this first verse of chapter 11 kind of gives a clear explanation of that theme. It says, "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. And if the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if the tree fall to the south or towards the north, in the place where the tree falleth, there it shall be. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap." And let me keep our fingers on that and go to Matthew chapter 11. And this gives another picture of the idea of what's kind of been running through my experience. Matthew chapter 11, verse 12, where Jesus says, "And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." So that's Matthew 11, verse 12. And the combination of those two scriptures is where I've been, and I'll just give you a just brief synopsis. I came to the Lord during the Jesus movement back in 1971, and so it was much more evangelical from what God was doing, and it was kind of on the peripheral of where Pastor Darrell had been, except that the guys that he was involved with at the time, a lot of them went and formulated house churches. Then I came in through some of those house churches. But my emphasis was always, God was always speaking to me about reaching the lost. It was something that was always constantly. In fact, the first time I ever tried, I remember one night I went out with this Catholic charismatic couple to a carnival, and we said, okay, we're going to try to witness, right? We'd never done this before. We'd read about it. We had all the tracts. We had packs of tracts, but we had never witnessed anybody, right? And I run across this guy I played football with named Steve Mahan, and I said, hey, I want to talk to you about something. And so I started talking about the Lord, and I said, yeah, you could receive the Lord. He said, can I? Like that. And I looked over at this couple, and I said, wow, this guy really wants to do this. It's like we weren't really expecting any results, right? But we got the results, and the guy became a believer, right? Which shocked us. That's like, wow, I think we were more shocked than he was about what happened. And this is kind of a theme that you see. Sometimes God works this kind of way where he outdoes our expectation. Definitely outdid our expectation there. And then when I left this area, went down to North Carolina, my dad was stationed in Camp Lejeune, and I was just, 18 or so, and God just put me on the street down there. And that was at the tail end of the Vietnam War, so there's packs and packs of people down there, all kinds of wild things going on at Camp Lejeune. And led a bunch of kids to the Lord, and we started a church down there. And I pastored there for about 4 years, and then went down to Florida. And then eventually ended up meeting and marrying Deanne. And then her family, of course, is from up in this area. We came up here to help her mom, and that's how everything focused about coming back up in this area. And when I came into this area, I had been involved a lot with house churches, which had kind of become so ingrown that they were no longer reaching out to anybody. So I just felt like the Lord told me just go on the streets. And so I started out going down in D.C., just go. It's like one of those things. And I'd been in the cabinet business for a lot of years, and I had a bad left lung from sheetrock. I did a lot of sheetrock business, and I wrecked my left lung from asbestos and sheetrock. So I went into the cabinet business, and I just had enough resource that if I sold all my tools, I could stay out on the street for a couple months. And just on a daily, going down there just pounding the ground daily. And I remember I came down to the last $5 I had, and I was talking to my wife. I said, wow, we're down to $5. That's enough to get me there on the metro, but it's not enough to get me back, right? So I said, what do you think we should do? Is this the end of what, we feel like this thing? And she said, no, just go down and see what happens. So I went down there, and yeah, and which is one of those things, right? And I went down there, and I was down in this kind of bad area, and this Muslim guy, I dealt with this black Muslim guy. You guys know, familiar with the Nation of Islam people. They're very hostile, right? And this Muslim guy comes up to me and goes, and this is out of the clear blue sky, just walks up to me, and he goes, he said, I've been watching you for the last couple months. And he said, I don't agree with anything you say. He said, but you see my stand. He was selling like oils and junk like that. You know how these guys have those stands down there, right? He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He said, because I think what you're doing is right, but I don't agree with you. He's very clear. And I don't agree with you, right? He said, I'm going to let you come up to my stand anytime you want. If you ask me, I'll give you $20 for any time you need it. Just like that. And this is like, you know, like your enemies become your friends in a sense. Though he never ever agreed with me, he was still open. And the thing that I was focusing on, I shared a couple of weeks ago in the church about, you know, those things where you don't understand the final result of the connections that you're going to. And I remember there was a guy, and he's been to this church with his wife, Jeff Mackler. I don't know if any of you guys remember him. He's an accountant, and his wife's an accountant. Well, this was a guy that was a really kind of messed up guy that we knew in school. And so we just focused, we're going to get this guy saved, right? So I worked with Jeff for a long time, and then as soon as I got him saved, I was afraid to let him go. You know? So what I did is I took him down, baptized him, and the next day I took him on a cross-country jaunt hitchhiking down to Florida to a Bible camp because I wanted to keep him because he was always so doped up for so many years that I didn't want to give him any free time to himself. Right? I was afraid of, like, it's the same old thing, like you're almost afraid that if you don't keep the convert, God won't, you know. So I'm dragging Jeff all across the United States, get down to Florida for a couple week Bible camp. Then he gets pretty, you know, solidly set into his walk with the Lord. Then he came back up in this area, and I left. And here was the irony of that. Maybe 2 years later, Jeff led somebody to the Lord over at Northern Virginia Community College, who just happened to be the woman I married, Deanne, which was one of those things where you don't know. And this is the thing that the Lord is saying to me about where we're at right now. You don't know what the final result of what you're going to do is going to be. You know, it's like it says wherever the tree falls, there it is. And this is not trying to come up with some unusual heavy-duty revelation. It's just a fact. You know, if the cloud is full of water, it rains. So if we're full of the Word, if we're full of the things of the Lord, it's going to rain. It'll come out. We don't need to pursue figuring a way to make it happen. We just have to make ourselves available for it to happen. And I think about it a lot because I think, you know, if I hadn't really been feeling at the time to really hammer in on Jeff, then my wife wouldn't have come to the Lord. Maybe she would have some other way. I don't know. But definitely it wouldn't have been through the circumstances God used to bring her into the Lord. So, and that was something that I saw with the same thing with that pastor that worked with me on the streets for a long time. And I found that in these experiences, when you just make a decision, you say, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to fervently pursue bringing a difference. And that's what I did in Valley Green. I said, well, you know, this is the murder capital of Washington, D.C. And when I went down there, they made me meet with HUD. And HUD said, look, you know, I thought they were not going to let us in there because we're Christians, right? And HUD said, okay, we've had the Orange Hat Brigade, we had the Guardian Angels, and they went through this list of people they've had, and they said, and it's all failed. And I'm thinking, okay, she's going to say the usual, you know, you guys are Christians, you can come down here, but you can't witness, you can't do all this stuff, right? But she said to me, she said, look, she said, we'll give you an apartment in this public housing unit on one condition alone. I'm thinking, oh, there we go, there's the caveat, right? She goes, that you reach the young men that are out here selling the drugs. And it was just like, you know, it's like, take us to the buffet there, you know, give us the right to go to the buffet. And so we set up in Valley Green. That was our first setup there, was down in Valley Green at a time when it was 3 to 5 people shot a week. And you couldn't go on those streets safely. I had numerous times when we had those little edgy little situations. Like one of our guys, kind of an obnoxious guy, but very fervent. Right? What I did is I renovated this apartment, put some guys in there just to live there. And then their job was to reach the neighborhood any way they could come up with reaching. We start a program called Minutemen and Minutewomen, which is, you know, named after the old Minutemen. And the first squad of those people that came in through that was all the guys that were hanging out that wanted to do something besides hanging out. And so we put them on a voluntary program of cleaning up Valley Green. And so they just go out every day, consistent like they're doing a job, and clean up Valley Green. Well, the next thing you know, the city hired them to go to the other public housing. They're still working for the city, going to other public housing, cleaning up the other areas. And so we had one guy who's really especially fervent young guy, right? Just off of getting saved and only about 18 or so. So he didn't have a lot of wisdom about people, but he's in your face fervent for the Lord. And he was becoming a liability because some of these guys, you have to know how to approach the guys in their drug doorways and all this kind of stuff because of the violence that they're prone to, right? And he had definitely rubbed them the wrong way. And so they had a guy that was after him. And there's literally after him. And of course, being at the Jesus house, the very first act we did at the Jesus house to start in there after they unwelded the door, because that's what they do, they weld the doors when they don't want anybody in there. The very first act that we did was clean off the guy that they shot the night before 9 times in that door. And it was brains, bone, everything all over the door. There's holes in the door and stuff. So after they welded, that's our first job, was to clean it up. So these guys are very violent, right? And so this John guy, he had really gotten these guys on his nerve. And then one night there's a shooting out front of the Jesus house, and some guy gets shot 6 or 7 times. And it's that guy, the bad guy, and it's after John, right? And he goes running where to? But to the Jesus house, right? Collapses on the floor, and there's John calling the ambulance, but he had to stick his finger in the hole in the guy's neck to keep him alive, And so that kind of brokered the peace between the drug dealer guys and the Jesus house, which was important because sometimes it would get hairy down there, being down there. And we really felt like God was saying, you got to be fervent. You're not gonna spread the gospel without fervency. And in some ways, fervency involves how you approach people. I felt like it involved, for me, when I'm on the street, I'm a very in-your-face kind of person. And not in the sense that I'm offensive, but in the sense that when I'm moving through the streets, I find who's the shark. I call him the shark. And that's generally the guy that runs the neighborhood. And you go to that person. You have to deal with that person before you're going to be effective in the neighborhood anyway. So you find the shark, and once you neutralize the shark, and it's usually going to be some kind of little incident or something that God does something. You'd wait for God to intervene. You neutralize the shark, and then you've got the neighborhood. Because once people see that, hey, it's okay. That guy's not, he's not going to be, I always look at it this way. If you're standing there and there's like 40 people around, there's only really 2 people who know what's going on spiritually. It's you and the shark. The shark sees you as the threat that you are to what he's doing, his money, his everything that's going on, and you see him as a threat to the gospel. And so all these other people are just players. They're just watching it go on. They're like they're in a play watching something God is doing, and they don't know what God's doing. I'll give you an example of that. One night I needed blankets because there's one area on 1100 in Southeast, right over by Potomac Gardens. There's one building that had no heat, and it was like maybe 20 degrees for a couple of days in a row, and the city wasn't going to give them anything, right? And I can understand the city's point because no one wanted to go down there and give these blankets to these families because there was, guys shot there all the time, right? So the only place I could get blankets was over at 2nd and D Shelter, which you all are familiar with, the homeless shelter downtown that Miss Snyder used to run, right? And so I went down there and I had to beg these guys, and these guys are very, socialist, liberal kind of mindset, and they don't want to give to anything that said Jesus loves you on it, So the guys, I said, look, I need 400 blankets. And they had a whole basement as big as this church and all the grounds full of blankets, right, stacked to the ceiling. They didn't want to come up off the 400 blankets, right? So they said, okay, we'll give you some blankets if we can go with you to distribute them. I said, sure, you guys can come along. I said, but before you go, I said, I got to warn you. I said, if something happens to me on the street, I'm saved. I said, I'm going to go, go to the Lord. I said, but if something happens to you on the street, I said, you guys are going to hell in a handbasket. I said, I really float along a lot of times by myself because I don't want to drag anybody with me that's going to get themselves in trouble, right? So and the first thing they did start laughing at us. That religious stuff, blah, 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 right? So we go down to the 1430 L Street, right? And we pull up the 1430 L Street, and there's this guy that I've been kind of dealing with on a peripheral, but haven't really, hadn't been a head-to-head yet with him, but was on its way. And I'd had a little trouble with him when I did a CBN distribution down there. The guy chased the trucks away. And so I'm looking at this guy, and I said, okay, there's going to be trouble with this guy. And I didn't kind of have a grasp at that moment that what was going to take place. So I get out of the van, I'm going around to get the blankets, and all of a sudden this guy jumps out with his 9mm, he's pointing at everybody, get back, And I just figured at that moment, I said, this is the time, this is that, one of those shows. This is like a show. He's got his gun, he's going to see what's going to happen. I felt invincible in many ways. I felt like, okay, nothing can happen to me. That's where God wanted me, nothing's going to happen to me. And then I started worrying about these other guys. And I had this old guy with me, this guy named Smiling. He's screaming. He said, "Oh, man, they shot somebody here last night. I read in the paper. They're going to kill us, blah, 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 blah." And they just went into an entire panic mode. And I opened it. The guy still got his gun. He's waving around at it. And I opened the door. I said, "Hey, can you back up a little bit with that thing? We should get these blankets out of here." And I just acted like it didn't matter, right? I just, okay, I'm not going to pay any attention to this guy, right? And so I just said, "Okay, blah, 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 blah." And then I got all the blankets out, and he finally he just, I guess out of embarrassment, put his gun away. And we got the blankets to the people and all this, and then I got back in the van. I didn't say a word. I said, "Okay, I ain't saying nothing. I know what's going on with these guys, and I'm not going to say a word to these guys," right? And they're just sitting, I looked in the mirror, you could see how their faces are like white as a ghost, right? So the next stop was B Street. And B Street, thank God they tore B Street down, because B Street and Simple City were always a constant war. I mean, 30 guys come from this way, 30 guys come from that way. And it was always trouble, and I spent much time down there and still had trouble, constantly down there, right? So I said, "Okay, we're going to B Street." And so we get down to B Street, and as soon as we got out of the van, I went over to the side, and boom, this guy's got his gun in my back, right? And all the guys that were standing there, they couldn't take it anymore. They just went in panic mode, jumped in the van and started screaming. I mean, they're in the van like children screaming, right? And so I told the guy, I said, "Look, back up. I don't have anything for you, blah, blah, blah." I'm talking to the guy and telling him he needs to repent and all that kind of stuff, right? And so I said, "Okay." I got through that situation, got him out of there. Finally, the guy put his gun away. And then I get all the stuff that we're bringing there. And then when we got back in the van, they were still screaming. And I said, "Hold it. You guys got to stop, We got a couple more stops to go." It was only when the second guy jumped out that I realized, this is the show God's doing. This is the show. He's teaching these guys something that no matter what I said to them about the Lord, they can't learn. They can't learn. There were goody-goody guys that were working in the homeless shelter, and if you work with those kind of guys, you know what I'm talking about. They're better than everybody else. That's why they're working with these low-class people in their minds, right? And they're better than anybody else, and they're better than all these other guys, these religious weirdos, which is what they call us. So they were just taken down to nothing. God just took them down to nothing. Then I was able to explain to them, "Look, the reason you're afraid because you don't know Jesus. I mean, you got religion, and you got social work, but you don't got Jesus Christ. Because if you had Jesus Christ, you wouldn't be worried about what happened to you tomorrow morning." So that was one thing, and that was one of the points that was in my mind as I was thinking about talking, is that Paul says that we're a display before men. And sometimes we have to be willing, if we're going to be out with the gospel, to be a display. Not understanding all the effects of what's going on or why it's going on, but we have to be willing to be a display, and we have to not be compromised. We can't, worry about the consequence of whatever's going on as long as we're staying right with what we're doing, our direction. That's what it says when it says, "The kingdom of heaven suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." Those are two different words. The first word means the kingdom of heaven is taken like you take a city. You surround it, you strategize about it, et cetera, et cetera. And the second word, violence, is a word that means energize, the Zoe, the people that are filled with the energy of God. That's where it says much fervency. When they were saying later on in Acts, it said, "Through much fervency are we pressed in the kingdom of God." And that word pressed is it's like the picture you get out of it is like someone takes a sieve, like you shake flour with, and you get stepped through the kingdom of God, just pushed through that, pressed into it. And that was what I found with that particular thing, is that you have to be willing for God to do something in those circumstances, and you have to, though in the times when I've been out on the street a lot, I wasn't thinking in terms of long range, where you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to be, but I did get constant confirmations that God was saying, okay, like that thing with Deanne coming to the Lord through Jeff. There was too much confirmation. Thing with Pastor Shannon, there was too much confirmation coming to the Lord, but it was based on sowing, just nonstop sowing. Just sow your seed, sow your seed, sow your seed, sow your seed, and God will bring it about, right? And one more thing, and then we'll fire at some questions about evangelism. I think we have some direction to look at about evangelism. On the trip I took Jeff, I got this poor guy just saved. I baptized him in the Alexandria Reservoir and brought him with me, right? So we're down there. Of course, everybody was arguing, you can't go in there, it's against the law to go in there. I said, well, I got to have water. I got to baptize this guy. So he snuck through the fence, and we dunked him, and then ran out, right? And so then I've got him with me hitchhiking down to Florida, right down to Erskine Holt's place. So we're going down the road, and you know how it is when they hadn't finished 95 yet? So we're sitting there somewhere in Georgia. They ran out of funds for 95. So you literally came to the end of the road, right? Then you had to walk over and find another part of the road that was, I guess it was alternate 17A. So we get on there, and we get picked up by these two crazy-looking guys, right? And so we're sitting in their car, and I don't know anything about these guys or anything. We're just sitting there, and God starts moving on us. And this was an interesting thing. I never had this kind of thing. I've heard about this thing happening, but I've never had it happen with my own experience. And God starts speaking to me about this guy, one of the guys up in there. And these guys were, at best, bikers. I mean, you could say at best they were like biker kind of guys. Down in that area down there, they have people live in a swamp. That's basically what they really were. It's like a swamp kind of guy like that is a combination of a biker and a bayou wild man or something. And they were talking about some pretty violent things. They were just up there talking like we weren't even in the car, right? And they might have been doing it to spoof us or whatever. I don't know. But all I know is as we were driving, all of a sudden, I saw this one guy come to the Lord in a Catholic charismatic meeting, right? And I said, hey, I said, I don't know what this means, because this is the first time it ever happened to me, so I sure didn't know. I didn't have a word for it, right? I said, but I seen this picture in my mind of you living in a certain place, coming to the Lord in a Catholic charismatic meeting. And all of a sudden, this guy's countenance changed. He goes, what do you mean like that? What happened? What are you talking about? I just explained. I said, I don't know any more details than this. I said, but I kind of think it's something that happened to you. Did this happen to you? And he's like, yeah, how'd you know? It's like this whole world opened up on this guy, right? So as I had opportunity to talk to him about the Lord and pray with him, they took us down to they said, look, you got to stay with us overnight. And I'm still thinking to myself, okay, I'm thinking, yeah, we're going to go down there, we're going to stay with these guys overnight, we're going to disappear in the swamp. Because we are now off of 17, and we were heading into the swamp, the dismal swamp, right? And I'm thinking somewhere down the line, these guys, because I never had this experience where I saw something before, so I didn't know if it was legitimate or not, right? This guy could just be shining me on so when they get ready to dump us, right? So anyway, they take us into their bayou house or whatever, biker house, and there on the table about as big as that thing was full of every kind of dope you could ever imagine existed in the world. And it turned out these guys were drug dealers for this whole big area, and there's people coming in and out. And the guy kept asking me, tell these guys what happened. So everybody that came in, we had an opportunity to talk to about the Lord, right? And then God gave us the grace of this guy taking us all the way down to the border of Georgia. He just said, look, I'm going to take you all the way down to the line, because if you get caught hitchhiking in Georgia, you're going to be in trouble, right? So, and I think a lot of this was for Jeff. Not only just for me, but for Jeff, because Jeff was a brand new believer. And the scripture tells us that God wants our faith in the works of God, not just in word. And if you just give good word, and the next guy that comes along is a little more talented, can undo that good word, right? So as we went further down, we get down to where Route 4 hit 95, which is over by Daytona. And we're hitchhiking there, and we're just maybe 100 miles from where we're going to go, right? And we get picked up by these three guys, this guy and this other guy and a woman. And, they're all sitting there talking, and this guy who had just come off of a 4-day at Biker Week down in Daytona, just come off of a 4-day binge, and they were still on the binge. So we're in the back seat of their car, and it's one of these like Grand Le Mans, and they're going off of the road to pass people on the right. And so I told Jeff, I said, man, we better pray, man. These guys are going to kill us before we get to Bible camp, We're going to be a for sure statistic here, right? And so we started praying. We're back there, like this. And they're just drunk, they're just out of their mind, just having a good old time, right? And then that same kind of picture thing came up. And I saw that lady. And I saw her wearing a certain color dress. I saw her walk into a Baptist church and kneel down and pray. And I just said, hey, I said, this happened to me before. I don't know what it means. I said, but I saw you when you were young. And I told her how old she was, where she lived, someplace in Alabama. And I said, I saw you going to this Baptist church. You're wearing a certain kind of dress, and you went in, you prayed, and you got saved, and then something hurt you, and you left. You left the Lord. And as soon as I did that, they slammed the brakes on and pulled off to the side of the road. Boom, like that. And the guy goes, the lady just started bursting out crying. And then the guy that was with her, it turned out that was her and her husband and his brother. And the guy that was with him started crying too. And this was just like all of a sudden we're in the middle of this. We weren't expecting. I just wanted them not to kill us on the road, to get us to Bible camp. I was not thinking this guy was going to just, we're in the middle of this, like, oh, God, oh, help us, God. So I prayed with the lady for her to come back to the Lord, and she did. And I prayed with, and here's the wildest thing, and I've never seen this happen, but I've heard about this happening before. The moment that I prayed with the guys, they became instantly sober. Just like they had not touched a drop of alcohol, right? And then all of a sudden they're back in the car, and after we prayed for like an hour sitting on the side of Route 4, they're back in the car driving real nice, And I'm thinking, well, the prayer to get answered. I don't know what all this happened here, how it happened or what it means, but they kept begging us to go to Tampa with them and to get into the drywall business with them, which they were doing, right? Which eventually I ended up in drywall business anyway, right? But they kept begging us to go, and I said, look, I can't do it. We got to go to this Bible camp. And so that was the end of that guy, right? So I never thought anything else about it. And then some years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, we were down on the National Mall down in Washington, D.C., and I was doing an outreach. I usually don't work on that part of town, though I have worked on that part of town successfully. We've done a lot of big events. In fact, I had a court case that went through by my brother's organization, American Center Law and Justice, that opened the door for all gospel ministry in the United States on any federal property through the constant, it's called Henderson versus Luan, through the constant battle we were always having with, you know that case? Yeah. Through the constant battle we're having with the Park Service for not wanting us to hand out gospel literature or anything like that. And the door had been open, I don't know how God did it, but he opened the door for us to have a table down on the National Mall, and some guy just took me under his wing, some old guy. This guy, they call him Cool Breeze, and he's the oldest vendor in D.C., right, him and his brother. Been there since 1945. And he said, look, here's what I'll do. He said, I'll set up a table. I'll pay a homeless guy to stay under there day and night so no one messes with it. And he said, I'll give you a sound system and a generator. So I'll fill it every day with gas. And all you have to do is on Sunday come in and sell some of these souvenirs he had. That was it. And then for the 6 days a week, I had the table, full blast. He paid for my gas every day, gave me the generator to run it on, and then did all that, right? And my only thing was that one day a week I did something for him, right? And it was great, I didn't know at the time that this guy was the guy that they picked up, the FBI had picked up when they had the over 70 numbers gang. They called it downtown. The big numbers bust they did was him and his brother and a couple other people, the FBI, right? But he was really nice to me. And when the doors became open for us to have a place where we could really be right in front of the air and space, all of a sudden people are bidding from us to try to buy a spot from us, right? So this guy comes up to me, and sometimes you have to be led by the Spirit. You don't want to be obnoxious as a person. But there are ways we can reach her. I feel tremendous confidence that even the socioeconomic area we're in, we can reach this area. And we can reach it because everybody's got the same one thing inside of them, and that's that God's shaped hole. That no matter what they got in life, it's not full. And so we can reach them. We can reach them with that concept, believing that and then asking God to give us strategy for... Oh, sorry about that. Okay, thanks. Hope I didn't get us stuck here.